In this video, I'm going to be working the underarm divide section of Brookdale Vest. It occurs on a wrong side row, and as you see in the instructions, it's broken out into 7 steps. So step 1 is simply to knit across your front panel stitches like you always would on a wrong side row. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first. Okay, so I've reached my front panel marker and I'm just going to slip it to the right needle. Then it says to purl to the edge trim marker. So I will bring the yarn to the front of the work and I will go ahead and purl to my edge trim marker. Now the instruction says to slip the marker. So we're going to just put it onto the right needle. And then it says to knit a certain number of stitches. So for my size, it says to knit 7. So I'll bring the yarn to the back of the work and I will knit 7 stitches. So then step 2 says to place the stitches that you just worked on the right needle onto a holder or piece of scrap yarn, keeping the markers in place. So these stitches that we just worked here, we now want to transfer onto a holder. I always use scrap yarn, so I already have a piece of scrap yarn cut here, and it's threaded through my tapestry needle. And so what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to turn my work to do this. I'm going to turn the work so that the right side is facing me. It's just a little bit easier for me to do it that way. And I'm just going to go ahead and transfer all of those stitches onto the tapestry needle that then will slide onto the scrap yarn. And when I get to the marker, it said to keep the marker in place. So that just means when you get to the marker, you're just going to slide it onto the tapestry needle just like you did the stitches. I'm just about done. And I did want to point out that when I am transferring to the tapestry needle, I'm kind of going into the stitch like you would if you were purling the stitch, kind of in this direction. Okay, so now all of those front stitches have now been transferred. So I'm just going to pull through the tapestry needle, make sure. So here are my ends. You can tie your scrap yarn if you'd like. Sometimes I like to do that just even loosely. The ends on here are long enough that I really don't have to worry about the stitches sliding off, but in case your scrap yarn maybe wasn't long enough, it's always good to just do a little tie. Okay, so now I'm going to turn the work back over because we had the wrong side facing us. So now we're at step 3, and step 3 says to bind off the next certain number of stitches depending on your size. So for my size, that's 12 stitches. So I need to bind off the next 12 stitches. So to do your first bind off, I'm going to insert my right needle, so my free needle. These were this was the needle that all the stitches we had just transferred off. So I'm going to insert that needle into this first stitch. Now your yarn is still attached to the last stitch that you had transferred, but you just kind of take it from the back like this. And to work a first bind off, when you're binding off in the middle of your work, you first need to work 2 stitches before you work your first bind off so that you have 2 stitches on the right needle. So now I can work my first bind off. So I'm going to go with my left needle. I'm going to insert it into the first stitch on the right needle and lift it up and over the second stitch. So that's 1 stitch bound off. Now moving forward, when we're binding off, we just need to work 1 stitch because we already have a stitch on the right needle here. So that was 1 stitch bound off. I'm going to knit 1 more, and now I can do my second bind off. This is my third. So I'm just going to continue like this until I have bound off 12 stitches. Okay, so I've bound off 12 stitches. Once you've bound off the right number of stitches, it then says to knit to your edge trim marker. And there's a stitch count in the pattern that should be the number of stitches you have on the left needle before the next edge trim marker. And this is just to ensure that you bound off the right number of stitches. So in my case, it says that I should knit 6 to the edge trim marker. So I'm going to count and make sure that I indeed have 6 stitches here before I get to that edge trim marker. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I do. If you don't have the right number of stitches, then it means that maybe you bound off too many or too few stitches. So you can tink at that point to tinking, meaning just unknitting the bound off stitches that you did. Okay, so I've knit my 6 stitches, and then it says to slip marker. And now we're on to step 4, which says to purl across the back stitches to the next edge trim marker. So now I'm going to go ahead and purl all my back stitches to that next marker. Okay, so I've just reached my edge trim marker. It says to slip the marker, so I'm going to put on the right needle, and then it says to knit a certain number of stitches depending on your size. And so for me, I'm supposed to knit 7 stitches. Okay, so then step 5 says to place the stitches that you just worked since the last bind off onto another holder or piece of scrap yarn. So all these stitches that are from the last bind off, which was right over here to where we currently are, we're going to transfer those onto scrap yarn just like we did for the front. So I'm going to take my tapestry needle, and I already have a piece of cut scrap yarn here. And because this is the back, it's going to need a much longer piece of scrap yarn than you probably had for your front. Okay, so just like I did from the front, I find it easier to turn the work so that the right side is facing me. And then I'll insert the tapestry needle into the front. So just like you would if you're like purling the stitch with the tapestry needle, and then just slide them onto the tapestry needle. And just like we did with the front, when you encounter a stitch marker, you're going to want to transfer that as well onto the tapestry needle. Okay, so now all of the stitches have been transferred. I'm just going to pull my tapestry needle through. Okay, and then I will just tie my scrap yarn. Just like that. And my ends are really, really long. I cut a really long piece of scrap yarn, so I'm going to go ahead and trim those just to get them out of the way. Okay, so now I'm going to turn the work back over so the wrong side is facing us. So now step 6 says to bind off a certain number of stitches. And this is just like we had done on the other side. So for my size, it says I'm supposed to bind off 12 stitches. So just like we did before, I'm going to take my working yarn. So it's coming from that last stitch that was on the scrap yarn. I'm just going to hold it in the back. And I'm going to go ahead and first knit 2 stitches because you need at first 2 stitches on the right needle in order to do that first bind off. And then I will bind off 1 stitch. So that's 1 stitch bound off. Then moving forward, I just need to knit 1 stitch because now we already have the 2 stitches on the right needle, and I can go ahead and bind off the 2nd stitch. So I'll just continue in this manner until I have bound off my 12 stitches, or however many stitches that it says for your particular size in the pattern. Okay, so I've bound off my 12 stitches, and then just like we did on the other side, it says to knit a certain number of stitches to the edge trim marker. And in my case, it said there should be 6 stitches to knit before on my left needle before I get to that marker. And I've confirmed that, yep, I have 6. Now, let's say that I had too few. Let's say I only had 5, meaning I had bound off 1 extra stitch. Let me just quickly show you how you would undo a bind off. The easiest way, there's a couple ways. First, you could just take this off the needle and pull the stitch through. So take that off like that and undo your yarn, and then just secure that stitch back on the left needle and secure that stitch back on the right needle. The other way that you could do it, I'm going to undo one more bind off, is without taking the stitches off of the needle, insert your left needle into the stitches from below. So you sort of have to turn the work. It helps to sort of pull the working yarn up like this to kind of see where it's coming out of, and see these strands right here. That's where it's coming out of. So you'd insert your left needle into the strands. And I say strands because in my case, I'm double stranding. If you were single stranding, it would just be 1. And then I would undo my right needle from the stitch and then pull it out. And this way the stitch is already on the left needle. And then I just quickly put that free stitch back on the right needle, just like that. So that's how you would undo a bind off if you had bound off too many stitches. But I'm going to go ahead and then redo those bind offs so I do have the right number of stitches. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep, I have my 6 stitches. So then I'm going to go ahead and knit to the edge trim marker. And then I will slip the marker. And then we're on the last step. So step 7 says to purl to the next front panel marker. So right here. Then we're going to slip the marker, and then we just have our front panel stitches, and just like we do on every wrong side row, I'm just going to knit all these stitches to the end. Okay, so now we finished our underarm divide. Let me turn it to the right side so we can take a look at how everything looks. So now we've divided our body into 2 fronts and a back. So here's our right front, and it's our right front even though it's on my left side here because it's always from the perspective of wearing the garment. So our right front stitches are the ones that are the live stitches on the needles here. And then here's our underarm where we bound off. And then I'm going to turn, and here are our back stitches. This is our back, and it's resting, all these stitches are just resting on scrap yarn. And then here's our left underarm. And then let me turn this again. And then here is our left front that's resting on the scrap yarn. And again, left because it's from the perspective of wearing the garment. And so now we can move on to the right front instructions because we're just going to be working on these right front stitches until we get all the way up to the shoulder. So that is how you work the underarm divide in the Brookdale Vest.